The dust of the marketplace clung to her skin, but she did not brush it away. Her eyes were fixed on a point beyond the stone walls, hollowed out by days without sleep. Every time the wind shifted, she heard it again. The sound of a body hitting wood, the rhythmic, violent thrashing that defined her home. She gripped the edge of a wooden stall, her knuckles white, feeling the splintered grain bite into her palms. In her mind, she saw the pallet. She saw the way her daughter's limbs arched, fighting against invisible restraints, the guttural cries that tore through the silence of their small room. The marketplace was a roar of commerce merchants shouting prices, carts rattling over uneven cobbles, the sharp tang of drying herbs, but to her, it was a void. She had come here seeking a remedy, a root, a poultice, anything to quiet the storm inside her child. She looked down at her hands, calloused and trembling. They were empty. The noise of the city pressed in, indifferent to the fact that her world was unraveling. She took a breath, the air thick with grit and heat, and forced herself to stand upright. The search had to continue, but the familiar paths had yielded nothing. She turned away from the stalls, her movements stiff, and looked toward the city gates, where the rumors of a traveler were beginning to stir the stagnant air. She walked away from the marketplace, her feet dragging against the uneven stone. Every alleyway felt like a dead end. 2 weeks ago, she had climbed the steep path to the local shrine, her lungs burning with the ascent. She had knelt on the cold floor, striking flint until the incense caught, watching the thin ribbons of smoke drift upward toward idols that never blinked. She had whispered the same prayer until her throat was raw, but the stone faces remained impassive. The air in the temple was stagnant. She had emptied her small leather pouch, placing every silver coin she possessed into the priest's outstretched palm. He had taken the offering without a word, his eyes sliding past her as if she were a ghost. She had waited for a sign, but nothing changed. The girl only grew weaker, her body a cage for a torment that no ritual could reach. She had tried the herbalists, the healers, and the charms. The silver was gone. The incense had burned to gray ash. She stood now in the shadow of a high wall, her hands empty and trembling. The silence of the alleyway was broken by the rhythmic clatter of hooves against stone. A group of travelers passed the mouth of the alley, their voices rising above the low hum of the city. One of them spoke a name, and it cut through the stagnant air like a sudden, cool breeze. Jesus. The mother straightened, her spine locking into place. She stepped out from the shadow of the wall, her eyes scanning the crowd. People were gathering near the main gate, their faces animated, their gestures wide. She heard fragments of stories, a blind man who could see, a leper whose skin had turned smooth, a fever broken by a single word. The rumors drifted through the city gates, swirling around her like a promise she had long ago stopped expecting. She felt a spark ignite in her chest, hot and sharp. She did not know who this man was, or why he had crossed the border into their land, but the desperation that had paralyzed her now transformed into a singular, driving force. She smoothed her hands over her arms, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. She looked back toward her home, then toward the gate. The choice was made. She turned her back on the city, ignoring the stares of neighbors who knew her daughter's condition, and began to move. She would find him. She would not stop until she reached his side. She moved through the marketplace like a blade through water, ignoring the sharp elbows and the annoyed glares of the merchants. The crowd was a wall of shifting weight, a dense mass of bodies that smelled of sweat and sun-baked stone. She did not look at the faces. She kept her eyes fixed on the center of the gathering, where a steady, calm movement suggested a path. She pushed, her hands gripping the shoulders of strangers, her feet finding purchase in the gaps between sandals. The air grew thick with the sound of voices, a low, constant murmur that vibrated in her chest. She stumbled as a man stepped into her path, but she caught herself. Then, the density broke. She saw him. He was walking with a measured, rhythmic stride, his presence casting a strange stillness. She did not hesitate. She lunged forward, her knees hitting the hard, dry earth with a jarring force that sent a shock of pain up her legs. "Lord," "Son of David, have mercy on me," she cried, her voice cracking. "My daughter is demon-possessed and suffering terribly." The plea hung in the air, but the man did not stop. He kept walking, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if the woman at his feet were nothing more than a shadow on the road. The silence that followed was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, colder than the morning air. She waited for a turn, a glance, a single word of recognition, but there was only the steady, rhythmic sound of sandals on packed earth. Then, the disciples moved. They stepped forward, their faces tight with annoyance, forming a wall of shoulders that blocked her view of him. "Send her away," one muttered, his voice sharp and dismissive. "She keeps crying out after us." The mother scrambled to her feet, her hands clawing at the air as she tried to find a gap in the line. She followed them toward the porch of a nearby house, her heart hammering against her ribs, refusing to let the distance grow any wider. She reached the porch, her legs failing her, and she collapsed. Her forehead struck the dry, packed earth with a dull thud. She did not rise. She pressed her face into the dirt, her breath hitching in her chest, and whispered, "Lord, help me." The sound was thin, stripped of all pride, a final plea against the encroaching dark. Then, the movement stopped. The steady rhythm of sandals on stone ceased. The air in the courtyard grew unnaturally still, as if the wind itself had been held back. A shadow fell over her, blocking the sun. She felt the gaze before she saw it. He had stopped. He turned, his movements slow and deliberate, and looked down at her. The disciples held their breath, their faces hardening in anticipation. "It is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs," he said. The words were not shouted. They hung in the air, sharp and cold, vibrating with a weight that seemed to pin her to the ground. She remained motionless, her forehead still pressed against the grit. She did not recoil. She did not scramble backward to hide her face in the shadows of the porch. Slowly, her hands pushed against the grit, and she lifted her head, her eyes, rimmed with the dust of the road, locked onto his. The silence of the courtyard deepened, the air becoming thin and sharp. She did not look at the disciples, nor did she acknowledge the onlookers. She spoke, her voice steady, stripped of the frantic tremor that had defined her earlier pleas. "Yes, Lord," she said, the words clear and deliberate. "But even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." The sound of her voice seemed to pull the very oxygen from the space. A ripple of movement passed through the men standing nearby, heads tilted, and the harsh lines around their mouths softened into confusion. She did not lower her gaze. She held the space, her posture rigid. The weight of the insult hung for a heartbeat, then fractured. She remained on her knees, watching the shift in his expression as the words took root. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, until the corners of his mouth twitched. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, a sudden softening of the hard, distant lines that had defined his expression. The tension that had held the courtyard in a frozen grip snapped. He looked down at her, and the icy distance was gone, replaced by a gaze of profound, steady warmth. He smiled. The movement was slow, deliberate, and entirely unexpected. "Woman," he said, his voice resonant and clear, "you have great faith. Your request is granted." In that instant, the air around her seemed to lighten, the pressure in the atmosphere shifting as if a storm had passed. The heavy, crushing weight that had sat upon her chest for months, a physical anchor of dread, vanished. She felt the sudden absence of the constriction in her lungs. Her heartbeat, previously erratic and shallow, smoothed into a steady, rhythmic pulse. She stood up, her legs no longer trembling, the strength returning to her muscles. She turned, her boots finding the path, and began to run. The miles ahead felt like mere paces, the ground beneath her feet firm and certain. The road back to the city gates blurred under her feet. She did not stop for water or shade. Her lungs pulled in the dry air, and her legs moved with a steady, relentless cadence. Each landmark she passed: the twisted olive tree, the stone well, the dry creek bed seemed to shrink in distance. She reached the outskirts of her home as the sun began to dip toward the horizon. She slowed, her breath hitching. The house stood silent. No guttural cries spilled from the window. No thrashing sounds rattled the wooden frame. She stopped at the threshold, her hand hovering over the latch. For a heartbeat, she stood motionless. Then, she pushed. The door swung inward on quiet hinges. The room was bathed in the soft, amber light of the setting sun. Her daughter sat on the pallet in the center of the floor, her back propped against the wall. The girl's eyes were clear, tracking the movement of the dust motes in the light. Her breathing was slow, deep, and rhythmic. The girl looked up, her lips curving into a small, steady smile. The mother crossed the room in 2 strides. She knelt by the pallet, her hands reaching out to touch the girl's fingers. The skin was cool, the pulse steady and strong.